Oakridge, Oregon, June 12, 2018. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense forest canopy surrounding Salmon Creek, casting dappled shadows on the water's surface. 8-year-old Ethan Miller tossed a small stick into the gentle current, watching intently as it bobbed and weaved around smooth river stones. In his left hand, he clutched his prized possession, a vintage red Matchbox 1967 Ford Mustang that his grandfather had given him before passing away last winter. "Ethan, dinner in 30 minutes!" His mother Sarah's voice echoed from their modest 2-story home, perched on the hillside overlooking the creek. "Okay, Mom," he called back, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet afternoon air. The Miller family had moved to Oakridge 3 months ago from Portland after Sarah accepted a nursing position at Peace Health Cottage Grove Community Hospital. The small logging town of roughly 3,200 residents, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, had been an adjustment for both of them. But Ethan had quickly discovered the joys of the outdoors, particularly Salmon Creek, which ran about 150 yards behind their rental home. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as her son navigated the familiar path through alder and fir trees toward his favorite spot. She'd established clear boundaries: never go in the water above his knees, always stay within shouting distance of the house, and be home before the porch light came on. Ethan had proven himself responsible, and the creek had become his sanctuary. As she turned back to finish preparing the chicken casserole, Sarah glanced at the clock, 5:47 p.m. There was a stack of patient charts she needed to review after dinner, but she'd promised Ethan they'd watch an episode of his favorite show together. First, life as a single parent wasn't easy, but they'd established a comfortable routine. Down at the creek, Ethan had found a particularly interesting formation of rocks that created a miniature peninsula. He carefully placed his toy Mustang on top of the tallest stone and began constructing a roadway of pebbles leading to it. The water gently gurgled around him as he worked, occasionally stopping to make engine noises as he imagined his car navigating the treacherous mountain pass he'd created. He didn't notice the sky gradually darkening as heavy clouds moved in from the west, an unexpected summer storm brewing over the mountains. The first drops of rain hit the water with barely perceptible plops, but within minutes, they'd increased to a steady patter. Ethan looked up, suddenly aware of the changing weather. He grabbed his Mustang and stood to head home, but paused as something caught his eye. A flash of movement on the opposite bank. Was that a deer? He squinted, trying to make out the shape through the trees and increasing rainfall. Curiosity got the better of him. He tucked his toy car into the pocket of his blue hooded sweatshirt and carefully hopped across several exposed stones to reach the other side of the creek, something his mother had explicitly forbidden. The opposite bank was steeper, less traveled, with denser vegetation and slippery clay soil that was quickly turning muddy in the rain. "Hello," Ethan called out, pushing aside a thicket of salmonberry bushes. The movement he'd seen had disappeared deeper into the forest. Lightning flashed overhead, followed by a crack of thunder that made him jump. It was at that precise moment that the gentle Salmon Creek began to change. Upstream, the sudden deluge had transformed numerous tiny tributaries into rushing torrents that fed into the main waterway. The creek began to rise, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. As Ethan turned to head back to the crossing point, his foot slipped on the muddy bank. He tumbled sideways, his right arm scraping against a jagged rock as he slid several feet down toward the increasingly angry water. The toy Mustang dislodged from his pocket, tumbling into the mud beside him. "Mom!" he cried out, but his voice was lost in another crash of thunder. The normally gentle creek had swollen to twice its usual width, completely submerging the stones he'd used to cross. Disoriented and frightened, Ethan struggled to climb back up the slippery embankment, but each attempt resulted in him sliding further down toward the churning water. In the kitchen, Sarah glanced at the clock again, 6:17 p.m., and noticed the sudden storm. She moved to the window and peered out toward the creek, but the heavy rainfall obscured her view. "Ethan!" she called, opening the back door. When no response came, she grabbed a raincoat and headed outside, a sense of unease growing in her chest. By 6:42 p.m., Sarah was frantically running along the creek's edge, screaming her son's name as rain pelted her face. There was no sign of Ethan anywhere along their side of the water. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. "My son," she sobbed into the phone. "He's missing by Salmon Creek. Please, you have to help me find him." Oakridge, Oregon, June 13th, 2018. Within an hour of Sarah's desperate call, the banks of Salmon Creek were illuminated by the harsh beams of flashlights as first responders from the Lane County Sheriff's Office and Oakridge Volunteer Fire Department began their search. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but the creek remained swollen and dangerous, rushing with unexpected force through the normally peaceful landscape. "We found footprints leading to a crossing point," Deputy Mark Reeves reported, his boots caked with mud as he approached Sarah, who sat trembling under a tarp near a makeshift command post. "Looks like small sneaker prints, consistent with a child's size. They lead to the other side, but don't show a return path." Sarah's face crumpled. "He knows he's not supposed to cross the creek. I've told him so many times." "Kids don't always follow the rules, Ms. Miller," Reeves said gently. "We've got teams moving along both sides of the water now, and we've called in additional resources from Eugene. Search and rescue is bringing dogs, and the state police are sending a helicopter once the weather clears enough." As midnight approached, the search area had expanded to cover a 2-mile stretch of Salmon Creek. The heavy rain had finally stopped, but it left behind treacherous conditions, slippery slopes, unstable ground, and dangerously high water levels. Fire Chief Robert Larson approached Sarah, who was now surrounded by several neighbors who had joined the search effort. "Ms. Miller, we need to pause the ground search until daylight. It's simply too dangerous right now, and we risk having more people injured." "You can't stop looking," Sarah pleaded, her voice hoarse from calling her son's name. "He's out there alone in the dark. He's probably terrified." "We're not stopping completely," Larson assured her. "We'll keep personnel stationed at key points along the creek, and the moment there's enough light, we'll resume full operations with fresh teams. In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you try to get some rest. Your neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, has offered to stay with you." Sarah knew they were right, but the thought of returning to her empty house was unbearable. Still, she allowed herself to be led back home, where she spent the night alternating between pacing by the window and making desperate phone calls to anyone who might be able to help. By dawn on June 13th, the search had intensified dramatically. The Oregon State Police helicopter swept low over the creek basin, using thermal imaging equipment to search for any sign of body heat among the trees. 3 K-9 units from Lane County. Search and rescue worked methodically along both sides of the expanded search area, which now covered nearly 5 miles of the waterway. News of Ethan's disappearance spread quickly through the small community. By mid-morning, more than 60 volunteers had gathered at the Oakridge fire station, organized into search teams by emergency management officials. "We'll be conducting a grid search of these quadrants," announced Sergeant Maria Hernandez of the Lane County Sheriff's Office, pointing to areas marked on a large topographical map. "Remember to mark your sections thoroughly and document anything unusual, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Local media arrived, setting up cameras and conducting interviews. Sarah, exhausted but determined, spoke briefly to a reporter from KZ9 News out of Eugene. "Ethan is a smart, cautious boy," she said, dark circles prominent under her red-rimmed eyes. "He's wearing blue jeans, a navy hooded sweatshirt, and white sneakers with green stripes. Please, if anyone sees him or knows anything, call the police immediately. As the day progressed, search teams found several items of interest. A child's sock caught on a branch nearly a mile downstream from where Ethan was last seen. What appeared to be fresh disturbances on several muddy banks and partial footprints in areas where the water had receded. Each discovery raised hopes momentarily, only to lead to further frustration as they yielded no definitive leads. By nightfall on June 13th, the search had covered approximately 8 miles of Salmon Creek and the surrounding forest, extending all the way to where the creek emptied into the Middle Fork Willamette River. Despite the extensive effort involving nearly 100 personnel and volunteers, there was still no sign of 8-year-old Ethan Miller. Sarah sat on her back porch that night, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she stared out toward the now invisible creek. The battery in her phone had died hours ago from the constant calls and updates, but she couldn't bring herself to go inside to charge it. "We're doing everything humanly possible," Sheriff Tom Bradley had told her that evening. "But Ms. Miller, I need to prepare you. The creek was running very fast after that storm. If Ethan fell in..." She had stopped, him with a raised hand. "He's alive. I would know if he wasn't. A mother would know." As stars appeared in the clearing sky above Oakridge, Sarah whispered into the darkness, "Hold on, baby. Please hold on. We're coming for you." Oakridge, Oregon, June 14th, 2018. By the morning of June 14th, 2 full days after Ethan's disappearance, the search operation had evolved into a methodical, multi-agency effort. The initial urgency had not diminished, but the tactics had shifted from immediate rescue to a more comprehensive recovery approach that none of the officials dared name in Sarah's presence. The FBI had joined the operation, sending 2 agents, specializing in missing children cases from their Eugene office. They set up in the Oakridge Community Center, which had been transformed into an incident command post filled with maps, whiteboards, and computer equipment. "We're implementing a systematic review of everything we know," FBI agent Diana Winters explained to Sarah during their morning briefing. "We're also expanding the search radius and bringing in specialized equipment that can search underwater, in portions of the creek and river." Sarah nodded mechanically, her eyes fixed on a large map where colored pins marked the areas already searched. She hadn't slept for more than 20 minutes at a stretch since Ethan disappeared, surviving on coffee and the sandwiches that neighbors continuously dropped off at her house. "What about the other side of town?" Sarah suddenly asked, pointing to an area northeast of where most search efforts had been concentrated. "Salmon Creek curves around and runs through there too." Agent Winters exchanged glances with Sheriff Bradley. "We prioritize the downstream areas first, given the direction of water flow and the likelihood that..." "I understand probability," Sarah interrupted, her medical training asserting itself through her exhaustion. "But Ethan is smart. If he managed to get out of the water, he might have tried to find his way back to a familiar area. He knows the creek runs near Harper's General Store. We shop there every week." The sheriff nodded. "We'll send 2 teams to cover that area today." As officials reorganized their search plans, local media coverage had expanded to national attention. Ethan's school photo, showing a freckle-faced boy with a gap-toothed smile and tousled brown hair, appeared on morning news shows across the country. The hashtag, #YouFindEthanMiller, was trending on social media, and a GoFundMe campaign to support. The search efforts and Sarah's unexpected leave from work had already raised over $30,000 from donors nationwide. Throughout the day, divers from the Oregon State Police explored deeper pools along Salmon Creek, while drone operators from a volunteer search organization methodically captured aerial footage of the entire waterway. Each team reported back with the same result: no sign of Ethan. That evening, as Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair at the command center reviewing the day's reports, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Miller, This is Dr. Alan Perkins from the University of Oregon. I'm a hydrologist who specializes in creek and river dynamics. I've been following your son's case, and I wonder if I might offer some assistance. Sarah straightened in her chair. Of course, anything that might help. I've studied the rainfall data from Tuesday and the topographical maps of Salmon Creek. Based on my calculations of water velocity and the documented rise in water levels, there are several specific locations where objects or people would most likely have been deposited as the water receded. Some of these areas might not have been prioritized in the standard search protocols. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a spark of hope. Can you come here? Show us these locations? And by June 15th, the fourth day of the search, Dr. Perkins had joined the operation, working closely with search coordinators to identify 7 high-probability areas that required closer inspection. These included several undercut banks, debris, collection points, and a particular oxbow where the creek doubled back on itself before continuing its journey toward the Willamette. The force of the water during the flash flood would have been substantial, Dr. Perkins explained as he led a team including Sarah and 2 deputies to one of these locations, about 3 miles downstream from where Ethan was last seen. But right here, the current creates a counter-eddy during high water events. Anything caught in the flow would likely be pulled into this recession and potentially deposited along this bank as the water level dropped. The area he indicated was a muddy embankment partially obscured by a tangle of exposed tree roots and accumulated driftwood, a chaotic collection of branches, logs, and debris gathered during years of seasonal flooding. As the team spread out to examine the area, the radio on Deputy Wilson's shoulder crackled to life. "Wilson, this is Reeves. We've got something at location 5, requesting confirmation from the mother." Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she spun toward the deputy. Location 5 was nearly 2 miles away, where Salmon Creek widened before flowing under the Highway 58 bridge. "I'll take you," Deputy Wilson said, already leading her back toward their vehicle. The drive took only minutes, but to Sarah it felt like hours. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had they found Ethan? Was he injured? Or had they discovered something else entirely? As they pulled up to the highway bridge, Sarah could see a cluster of officials standing near the water's edge. Among them was Frank Devereaux, a 65-year-old local fisherman who had volunteered with the search effort since the beginning. He was holding something small in his weathered hands. Sarah broke into a run before the vehicle had fully stopped. As she approached the group, they parted silently to let her through. Frank looked up, his expression solemn as he held out his palm. There, caked with dried mud but still recognizable, was a small red toy car, a vintage Matchbox 1967 Ford Mustang. Sarah's legs gave out beneath her as she reached for the tiny object. "That's Ethan's," she whispered, her voice breaking. "His grandfather gave it to him. He never goes anywhere without it." Frank nodded grimly. "Found it half buried in the mud right over there," he said, pointing to a flat, muddy bank about 20 feet away. "Was casting my line when I spotted something red reflecting the sunlight." Sheriff Bradley knelt beside Sarah. "Ms. Miller, this is the first solid lead we've had. We'll concentrate all our resources on this area immediately." Sarah stared at the tiny car in her palm, rubbing away the dried mud with her thumb to reveal the familiar scratches on its roof where Ethan had once tried to customize it with a paperclip. The discovery confirmed her worst fears, but also renewed her determination. If the creek had carried the toy car this far, what else or who else might they find? "He's here," she said with quiet certainty, rising to her feet. "Somewhere near here, I can feel it." As additional search teams were quickly redirected to the area surrounding the Highway 58 bridge, Sarah refused to release her grip on the tiny red Mustang, the first tangible connection to her son she'd had in 4 agonizing days. Oakridge, Oregon, June 15-16, 2018. The discovery of Ethan's toy car transformed the search operation. Within an hour of Frank Devereaux's find, the area beneath and surrounding the Highway 58 bridge had become the epicenter of activity. Search and rescue teams methodically combed every inch of the muddy banks, while drone operators captured detailed aerial footage of the wider area. Dr. Perkins, the hydrologist, stood with Sheriff Bradley and Agent Winters, analyzing the location where the toy had been found. "This actually makes perfect sense," he explained, pointing to patterns in the mud. During the flash flood, the bridge piers would have created a hydraulic cushion, slowing the water's velocity just enough for heavier objects to settle. The toy car is small, but dense, made of die-cast metal. It would have sunk quickly once the current slowed. Agent Winters nodded. And if the boy was still holding onto it when he went into the water, the implication hung heavily in the air. No one wanted to complete the thought aloud, especially with Sarah standing just yards away, watching divers prepare to search the deeper pools beneath the bridge. As afternoon stretched into evening, the search continued with renewed vigor. Powerful lights were brought in, illuminating the area as darkness fell. Sarah refused all suggestions that she return home to rest, instead accepting a folding chair and blanket from a Red Cross volunteer who had been providing support to the search teams. Just after 9:30 p.m., a shout came from the eastern side of the bridge, where a team had been searching through a dense patch of blackberry brambles that extended from the water's edge up a steep embankment. "We need medics here now," came the urgent call. Sarah was on her feet instantly, the blanket falling forgotten to the ground as she ran toward the voice. Sheriff Bradley caught up with her, holding her arm as they navigated the uneven terrain. "Let me through," she cried, pushing past a deputy who tried to block her path. What she saw made her heart stutter, a small figure curled on his side beneath the protective canopy of brambles, partially hidden by undergrowth and debris carried by the floodwaters. "Ethan!" Sarah's scream echoed off the concrete bridge, overhead as she lunged forward, only to be firmly held back by Sheriff Bradley. "Let the medics assess him first," he insisted, his voice both firm and gentle. Two paramedics carefully made their way into the thicket, cutting back thorny vines, to reach the motionless form. Sarah watched in agonizing suspense, unable to determine from her position if her son was breathing. "We have a pulse," announced one of the paramedics after what seemed like an eternity. "It's weak but steady. He's alive." The collective exhale from the gathered search team was audible. Sarah collapsed against Sheriff Bradley, sobbing with relief as the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Ethan before carefully extracting him from his thorny shelter. As they emerged, Sarah finally got a clear view of her son. His face pale and scratched, his clothes torn and muddy, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle. But most importantly, his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. "He's severely dehydrated and hypothermic," explained the lead paramedic as they transferred Ethan to a waiting stretcher. "And that arm is definitely broken, but considering what he's been through, he's in remarkably good condition." Within minutes, they had Ethan in an ambulance, with Sarah beside him clutching his uninjured hand as they sped towards Sacred Heart Medical Center in Eugene, the nearest trauma facility. She placed the tiny red Mustang on the blanket, covering his chest, her tears falling freely as she whispered reassurances to her unconscious son. The next 48 hours were a blur of medical procedures, specialist consultations, and gradual improvements in Ethan's condition. His injuries included a compound fracture of his right arm, severe dehydration, hypothermia, numerous lacerations, and a mild concussion. Remarkably, there was no evidence of water in his lungs. He had somehow avoided drowning despite being swept away by the flash flood. Late in the afternoon of June 17th, Ethan finally regained consciousness, his eyes fluttering open to find his mother dozing in a chair pulled close to his hospital bed, her hand still holding his. "Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from days without use. Sarah jolted awake instantly. "Ethan? Oh my God, baby, you're awake." She touched his face gently, as if afraid he might disappear again. "My car," he rasped, his eyes darting around in confusion. "Grandpa's car." Sarah smiled through her tears, reaching for the small red Mustang that now sat on his bedside table. "It's right here. Frank found it by the creek. It helped us find you." Ethan's fingers weakly closed around the toy as recognition dawned in his eyes. "I fell," he whispered. "The water was so fast." "I know, sweetheart. You don't have to talk about it now. Just rest." But Ethan seemed determined to explain. "I got caught on something underwater. It hurt. Then the water pushed me really far. When I could stand up, I tried to walk home, but I didn't know where I was." Sarah listened in wonder as her son recounted fragments of his ordeal. How he had been swept nearly a mile downstream before managing to grab onto a submerged log. How he had eventually dragged himself onto the bank with his uninjured arm, and how he had sought shelter in the blackberry thicket when night fell, and he began to feel impossibly cold. "I knew you'd find me," he mumbled as exhaustion began to overtake him again. "Just like you always find my stuff when I lose it." 3 days later, Ethan was discharged from the hospital, his arm in a cast that was already covered with signatures. From hospital staff, search team members, and the many well-wishers who had followed his story, Frank Devereaux had visited twice, earning the lifelong gratitude of both mother and son. As Sarah drove them home to Oakridge, following the same route along Highway 58 that passed over Salmon Creek, Ethan asked her to stop at the bridge. "Are you sure?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. He nodded solemnly. They parked safely off the highway, and Sarah helped Ethan make his way down to the water's edge, keeping a firm hold on his uninjured arm and staying well back from the now calm creek. The area looked entirely different without the search teams and equipment, peaceful once again as water flowed gently beneath the bridge. Ethan stared at the spot where he had been found, then at the water that had nearly claimed his life. Finally, he looked up at his mother. "I want to take swimming lessons," he said decisively. "Really good ones." Sarah pulled him close, careful of his cast. "That sounds like an excellent idea." As they turned to leave, Ethan reached into his pocket with his good hand and pulled out the red Mustang, studying it thoughtfully before returning it safely to his pocket. The creek continued its eternal journey behind them, whispering secrets of survival and resilience that only Ethan would ever fully understand. In the small town of Oakridge, Oregon, his story would be told for years to come, of the boy who disappeared playing by the creek, whose precious toy car led searchers to him 4 days later, and whose will to survive proved stronger than the rushing waters that had carried him away.